Christian education that transforms us to live the gospel is a core value of this church. And if we're going to be transformed to live the gospel, we must know the gospel. We must be taught the gospel. We must understand that the word gospel means good news. And the reason we have good news is because we have contended with bad news. We have struggled with problems. We have lived through family dysfunction. We have survived injustice. We have walked in the accusations that were unfounded about us. We have remembered that in the midst of our anxiety, the gospel transforms lives. I'm going to tell you a story this morning as a part of our series on Anxious Without a Cause, looking at the problem of anxiety through the eyes and life of King David. I'm going to tell you the story about the latter part of his years. I'm going to tell you the story about his conflict in his conflicts in his family. I'm going to say something I don't normally say. One, it's a very large story, and I see the time that you guys left me with. I feel the appreciation. I won't read you the whole story. We will go through it in a summary. But I have to give this warning too. This story highlights the need of the gospel because it's dark. It's problematic. It's difficult to tell, and it's difficult to hear. And I give you that warning up front. So we will summarize and we will be careful on how we articulate parts of the story. We talked about last week that King David's life was a life filled with anxiety. We think about him as being a life full of joy, and that is also true because you can have joy and anxiety. But when we read the Psalms, and we read some of them on Wednesday night in the prayer group, you can see David's deep anxiety. And we talked about how King Saul was the cause of his early life anxiety. And you can go online and you can find that sermon, Saving Saul. But when David had the chance to kill his anxiety, when David had the chance to kill the cause of his anxiety, when God himself led David to the place where David had his spear at the head of all of his problems, David would not touch Saul. Because David remembered where he came from. David remembered who called him. David put his trust in the one who called him. And David's anxiety was taken away, and he was granted with 40 years of being king. And now I begin the decline of David's years. As I told you the beginning of his reign, and now I will tell you about what gets him thrown out of his capital. And the story begins with Tamar, his daughter. And Tamar had a half-brother, Ammon. And Ammon was not a good man. But Ammon was David's eldest son. Ammon was heir to the throne at this time. And Ammon did unthinkable things that destroyed Tamar. And Ammon took no responsibility for them. He was given the opportunity by, of all people, Tamar, to make it as right as could be made. And he put her to shame. And Absalom is her hero. Absalom rises up to defend her honor. Absalom does what David refuses to do. David is king. David is on his throne. David fails to act. David is deeply troubled, sinking in the despair of what happened, but freezing in the action of justice. And it is easy to sink into despair. It is easy to be overwhelmed by what has happened. There are evils in this world that we cannot process sometimes, but evils demand justice. But David, you see, he had had some of his own indiscretions. And David has some things that aren't that different than his eldest son. And when we talk about anxiety, one of the things I'm going to tell you about anxiety is when we talk about anxiety, not always, sometimes it's chemical, not always, sometimes it's biological, not always, it comes from many circumstances in life. But when we talk about anxiety, a good percentage of the time, it's produced by generational dysfunction. Where did Ammon learn to do the evil that he did? And David has already lost one son. And now David must lose another. David must stand up and make this right. But David won't do it. Unfinished business is a psychological term coined by Gestalt. Unfinished business is the traumas that we are healing from, but never finish the work because it was too hard. And there's not a person here in person today or watching who doesn't have unfinished business. But I'm here to tell you that unfinished business is a great source, a catalyst, if you will, of anxiety, because your unfinished business will cause you to choke when you're called to move. David doesn't want to lose another son, and so he'll lose more than another son. Absalom will attend the feast and take care of Ammon by his own might. And David will be heartbroken again. But how would he let his eldest son away with this? Would he really be appointed king of God's people? Sometimes you have to do what's right when it's painful. Sometimes the way through anxiety is hitting it head on. Sometimes it's the uncomfortable things that contains it. When we have cancer, we look at every alternate way to heal it, but there comes a time, in many cases, where you cut it off or you lose the whole body. Absalom fled. He went into to the son of Ahmad, to the king of Geshur. And David mourned many days for his son. And it's an interesting thing here, the way the author of 2 Samuel puts it. Because it doesn't sound like he's mourning Ammon. It sounds like he's mourning Absalom. Sometimes in failing to deal with a subpar problem, we'll lose the apex problem too. After Absalom fled to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years, and that's significant. David has a lot of time to make this right. David has a lot of time to go before the people and confess his inaction. David has a lot of time to take a battalion and go down to Geshur and meet with Absalom. But after 3 years, Absalom returns. And for 2 years after he is present, David knows he's there, The whole kingdom is talking about him being there. David has no problem seeing things from the rooftop of the palace, if you remember. He sees Absalom in the marketplace, at the gates, at the place of influence, talking to the leaders. And for 2 years, after the 3 years in waiting, David does nothing. David refuses to see him face to face. Avoidance is a double-edged sword when it comes to managing anxiety. There are hard things, even for Christians, even for people who are living the life the best they can and are covered by grace. And I'm going to tell you, and you'll see later in the sermon, I'm not against avoidance. There is a time and a place for avoidance, and we're going to talk about that too. But there also comes a point, particularly when you're dealing with interpersonal relationships, important interpersonal relationships. We don't want to have the hard talk. But the longer we go without the hard talk, the deeper our anxiety about it goes. And what started as up here has moved to here. You know what happens after it's been here, right? It's like a punch to the gut every day. It's like waking up and feeling the gut punch. And the gut punch stays with you the whole day long. And while David is dealing with the gut punches of anxiety, Absalom's making no slacking use of his time. Absalom is out there making sure he is seen in the marketplace. Absalom is out there making sure people know, I want to see my dad. Absalom is out there dropping hints and suggestions, you know, that there is someone who believes in justice in the kingdom. Absalom's sending request after request to meet with David. David's advisors are saying, meet with this guy. David will not meet with him. And finally, Absalom sets Joab, David's chief advisor, his field on fire and burns down his crops to get a meeting with the palace officials. And it's there that Absalom has sealed his fate and doesn't know it. Be careful of who you force by manipulation and corruption to do your bidding. Absalom says, now I want to see the king's face. If I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death. He's got a point. It's now been half a decade. If he's a criminal, call him a criminal. Cut his head off. If he is not, admit that you were the one that were wrong when you didn't take action. David eventually meets with him. This is not the young David who fought Goliath. This is not the young David who played the lyre for Saul. This is the aged, broken David, whose family dysfunction is catching up with him. But finally, the King David summoned Absalom. And he came and he bowed down with him, face to the ground before the king. And Daddy David kissed his betraying son. And his son went out. And whenever time he was at the marketplace or at the gates is where the gossip went down. It's where people came in and out of the city. Everyone had to go through the gates. So the gossip handlers stayed out there. Like 2 people were at the gates, money handlers and gossip handlers. Like, that's the commodity of corruption right there, right? And he'd be out there at the gossip gates, and people would be coming back and forth into Jerusalem to tell their stories, and he would be there to meet them. And whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him. Oh, sorry, reboot slide. And Absalom would add, if only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case could come to me, and I would see they receive justice. It's not only textbook manipulation, it's grade A textbook manipulation. Because Absalom's own situation is proof of the words he says, and they cannot be refuted. Because for half a decade, he waited for a just judge to deal with his anxieties and do what was right. And so every time he looks at the most petty thing that happened to the most outrageous things that happened, he's at the gate saying, I get it, I know. He's my dad, but I wish it was me who got to judge. I wouldn't treat you the way you're being treated, because I myself was treated that way. David keeps the same action but changed the motivation. Did you hear me? David will hold the action, but he will change the motivation. And there is wisdom to reflect. There is wisdom to think about before you rush to your action. David had a problem of waiting too long, and he wasn't using any wisdom. But at this point, he's going to do the same action for a different reason. And for 4 years, David held his peace. Do you get what's going on here? Absalom is at that gate. Absalom is in the marketplace. Absalom is at everybody's birthday party. Absalom is making sure he makes it to the baby dedications. Absalom will just come come and visit you in your home and tell you how much your injustice matters to him. David knows it. Holding your peace is not avoidance like David's first avoidance. David's first avoidance was about avoiding accountability. And that kind of avoidance will always lead to self-crippling anxiety. David's avoidance at this stage in the story is an avoidance that decreases anxiety. Edwin Freeman, a Jewish rabbi who is also a leadership guru and a certified social worker, puts it this way. It is to present a non-anxious presence. And I'm going to tell you a secret that anyone who ever studies leadership knows. It don't matter your title. It don't matter your position. In a crisis, this 100% true, never is wrong. In a crisis, any organization will default to the most calm person in the meeting as the leader. That's the power of a non-anxious presence. And for Christians, that power is to not forget. We don't need to defend ourselves. We need to show ourselves as belonging to God. Do not feed the trolls. You guys aren't on TikTok. Do not feed the trolls. Feeding the trolls are like, oh, this is what it's like. You ever fed one pigeon a fry? Come on, you've been at McDonald's, you got those McDonald's. Not you good vegans, they might have, they won't eat your tofu. You've been out there with your pita bread. And you throw one to a pigeon, and 10 come back. Do not feed the trolls. If you go around defending yourself with every little accusation that somebody makes about you, I promise you, more people are coming with more accusations. And especially if you are successful at defeating the accusations. You are putting out a challenge to every toxic person who knows you. For the troll then knows, if I can take that person down, who has a record of a non-anxious presence, no one is going to mess with me. David holds his peace for 4 years. And then Absalom sends secret messengers throughout the tribe of Israel. Who are the secret messengers? The fathers of the birthday parties he went to. Who were the secret messengers? The merchants at the gate he gossiped with. Who were the secret messengers? Those who also didn't get what they want from the king. And it's fascinating in 2 Samuel 15:10 because there are messengers in every tribe. And I want to tell you something. Oh, I want to say it, but God forgive me. David knows who those messengers are. And don't you ever think that pastors don't hear the gossip. And don't you ever think they don't know exactly who said it. Because trolls have no loyalty. Absalom sent out secret messages throughout the tribes of Israel to say, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron. A very prominent city just outside of Jerusalem. Close enough to attack Jerusalem. Far enough away from Jerusalem to not be intercepted. And messengers come flying into the palace. And they told David, the hearts of the people of Israel is with Absalom. I want you to understand something. David is still king. This is the second act of the tale of two kings in David's life. I will tell you how he dealt with the other second king, Saul. We'll seal what happens with the second king, Absalom. But right now, David is king, and he has the full military power of Israel. What will he do? He can march out of Jerusalem and go to Hebron. He can bring his army. He can bring his soldiers. He can mount a defense. And the truth is, he's going to win if he doesn't. Sometimes winning, though, is not what's important to a leader. Sometimes defending your honor can't be your motivation. Sometimes you have to love your organization more than your treasured position in it. And David knows he can march and he can win and he can take this Absalom, his kid. Put him over his knee and give him a good spanking like he should have years ago. But if he does, the people of Israel are with him. He will have to fight and kill his own citizens. He must decide in this moment of time, does he love prestige? Does he love position? Or does he love his mission? And back in Jerusalem, he gets up off his throne. And his advisor looks at him and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "We've got to get up and leave this place, lest Absalom march with the people against us." And his whole cabinet comes around him. His whole barrage comes around him. And they're like, "If you go, we go with you." And this is where David excels. He sends everybody back who will go back. And he says, I will walk this walk through Kidron Valley by myself. Now, there are people who follow him. There are people who go. They go weeping with him. But anyone he can convince to go back, he convinces to go back. And so Kidron Valley from David's palace is right down the palace in Jerusalem, up the Mount of Olives. The whole countryside wept as all the people passed by. The king crossed Kidron Valley, and all the people moved towards the wilderness. And this is why David will write, though I pass through the valley of death, it's the same valley. It's the same path. It's the same road. The one who comes in the name of David. Jesus will walk to get to Gethsemane and sweat blood, because he too loves his people more than his mission. He loves his mission and people more than his position. Absalom takes control. He quickly begins to dismantle everything David has done. Remember how this started. Remember why Absalom is angry. Remember the just reason of Absalom's wrath. But Absalom takes every one of David's concubines, which means wives, and publicly defiles them in front of the kingdom. Not everybody who starts out with a just cause can handle the power of just results. What did David do? He got off his throne. The way to defeat anxiety is to let go of your own illusion of having control. And I know the heat has finally kicked in and you're all saying, praise the Lord, but you're also all going to sleep. This is why we didn't want to turn the heat on too early, but I digress. Listen to me. Get off your throne in the crisis. Listen to me. Accept the reality. It's the most liberating thing you're ever going to do in your life in a crisis. Accept the reality that you don't have control because you never had control. Because control never belonged to you. And the more you try to hold on to control that never belonged to you, is the more you are actually committing blasphemy. And all your anxiety is the cause of the great sin in this situation of thinking you're worthy of being the king of your life. The greatest question I can ask you this morning and I ask you never to let go of, is who wears the crown of your life. Who wears the crown of your life? There can only be one king. I'm wrapping up. Hang in with me. There can only be one king. Are you still there? There can only be one king. There can only be one king, and he is not Saul. There can only be one king, and he is not Saul, and he is not Absalom. There can only be one king, and he is not Saul, and he is not Absalom, and he certainly is not David. It's Jesus. And he's always had the control. And the only time he's going to give it to you is when you stop grasping it yourself. David didn't give his throne up to Absalom. He gave it up to Jesus. And Absalom, fleeing a battle, gets caught in a tree. It's probably why I cut my hair from my youth. People in the Bible keep getting it caught in trees and dying. Oh yeah, Absalom blackmailed Joab. Burnt his crops down. And gets his head cut off by him when he can't get his hair out of the branches. You go living a hairy life, and you might get a little bit more than a haircut. And now David is back on the throne. And now David is in control. And now, all of David's advisors, are you with me this morning? All of David's advisors, come on, be with me this morning. All David's advisors are coming around him because he is the king. And they want to make sure that he doesn't think that they were a part of the people that Absalom went to the birthday parties for. And they start pointing out everybody who was. And they start demanding of their king. He put them to death. David remembers when he had the spear to Saul's head. He didn't do it because control was not his. And David says, what right do you have to interfere? And I love what David says here. Please pay attention to the words. These words are on purpose. What right do you have to interfere? Should anybody in Israel be put to death today? Look at this last sentence. Look at this last sentence. Don't you know that today I am king over Israel? And he is. Because he's given his control to Jesus. And so Jesus can give his throne to David. The same man who ran from the throne saying, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to God, is the same man who, when he knows that he has given his heart to God, is unapologetic in the role he holds. Casting crowns is the only thing that will keep your throne. If you want to get out of your dysfunction, if you want to get out of your situation, there's a little thing you can learn in every 12-step program. You're helpless. And you can only be saved by surrendering to God. Cast your crown to the ground. And Jesus won't set you on David's throne. The book of Revelation says he will seat you on his throne before all of heaven.